Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Dawn Bell, the Global Development Head for Strategic Partnerships at Novartis.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We are thrilled that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast. A special thank you to our New York Bio member and partner, Miss Pro, for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. And a special thank you to our guest, Dawn Bell from Novartis today. We have the unique opportunity to talk with someone who has a deep history in both early stage development as well as pharma development and commercialization. So we're really going to be able to cover the waterfront today about all the things that you all are interested in and are particularly important to our New York Bio ecosystem. As always, and as I almost always forget, the housekeeping. So please ask your questions for Dawn today during the course of our conversation with her. Put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and Derek and I will get to them throughout the course of our conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to more fully introduce Dawn, and then we'll get started. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thanks so much, Jennifer. So I get excited for all of these, but as I like to say, this guest has everything. So Dawn, you've had a spectacular career. You've led the launch of more than 12 medicines, including Entresto, which is a $3.5 billion product. You've led the launch of gene therapies. You've been the CEO of startup companies. You've done ecosystem building. We literally have matched all the kinds of guests that we have into one and into you. So it is wonderful to have you here this morning. As we usually start, we usually kick off with a bit of an origin story. So in order to get things rolling, how about you tell us kind of how you got into biopharma in the first place and how you got to where you are?
Sure. So, I've always been attracted to science and research from a very early age, and actually spent a lot of time in hospital as a kid with really severe asthma. So I was attracted to the healthcare system. And as I kind of grew up in college, and I gravitated to the healthcare system and went into pharmacy training. But I realized very early on in pharmacy training that what I really liked was research. And I had a very limited exposure, kind of a sheltered existence. And I thought the only place you could do high quality research was in academia. So that's what I did. So I had an academic career. I stayed through tenure. Turns out it wasn't a great fit for me. And luckily for me, I was at a turning point in my career. I met Clive Meanwell, founder and longtime CEO of the medicines company. And that really changed my life. So I was inspired by Clive's vision and mission for the medicines company, and so impressed by him as a person that I actually left my tenured faculty post and joined the medicines company while they were in the middle of a confirmatory phase 3 trial for their first molecule, bivalirudin or Angiomax. So that was a pretty risky move, but I was convinced that that was the place that I wanted to be, and honestly, I've never looked back since then. I stayed with them for about 6 years. I worked in various roles on the brand Angiomax, and we grew the brand while I was there. We also grew the pipeline. I worked on a second molecule, Cangrelor, which is now an approved medicine for coronary angioplasty as well. And we grew the company from about a $400 million valuation to over a $2 billion valuation, and from about 40 employees to about 200 and some when I left. And that was just an amazing education and an amazing experience and lessons and entrepreneurship and in growing a biotech company. And it certainly fueled me to start my own company some years later. I got enamored by some IP from Emory University and decided to take a license on that and build a company around a biologic for cardiac surgery. Very challenging indication. This was 2012, very challenging time to raise money. But we managed to raise a seed round to do some confirmatory experiments, and lo and behold, couldn't confirm the academics' work, which I later learned was not so uncommon. And we gave the license back. If I had to do it over again, I probably would have done the confirmatory work before we took the license and paid some of those fees. But Emory was great to work with, and that was a great experience as well. And during that time, I had an epiphany that all roads lead to M&A. And I realized, having come up through really the founder-led biotech ecosystem, that I didn't understand strategics. I didn't have a network within the strategic community, and that a next step for me should be to go into big pharma. I know it sounds a little backwards, but I thought, I need to understand my customer. If I want to be a good biotech CEO, I really need to know that world. And so, I got really lucky, landed a terrific role at Novartis, ended up, leading what was to become Entresto. And my plan at the time was I would be here 3 to 5 years, and then I'll go back to biotech. So that was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, how's that working out for you?
Just a multiplier. It's okay.
Yeah. So this is fascinating, right? So and let's kind of dive in on Entresto a little bit, because we know it now, and we think about these kind of blockbuster drugs after they're on the market, and almost you look back and you think it's almost kind of like a given that they got to where they were. But if we wind the clock back a little bit, what was it like when you stepped? So at what point did you step into help lead development there? What did things look like? What was the kind of surrounding, feeling like within the company? And what were some of the things that you had to do in order to kind of get it where you even could get onto the market?
Yeah, it was an interesting, a really fascinating journey. And I can't remember who it was that said that it's not a great drug unless it's been killed 3 times. And I think Entresto certainly meets that, those criteria big time. So I joined when we were in the phase 3 trial, the confirmatory phase 3 trial paradigm. The enrollment was near completion when I joined. So this was a cardiovascular outcomes trial. So how those work is once you complete enrollment, patients are followed for a period of time until you accumulate enough events as to where you can, declare victory or not. And so I'd say I joined, about 2 years into the phase 3 program. Now, this program did not go through phase 2 because there are, as we can talk about when we talk about heart failure trials in general, there are no good surrogates in phase 2 that really tell you whether or not how to design your phase 3 or how your phase 3 was successful. We had good dose ranging data from hypertension studies, and there was, dose limiting hypotension. So we had a very clear idea of the dose from that and other pharmacology studies. So we went right into phase 3. So that was a big bet. I'd say when I joined the company, all eyes were on serelaxin. You guys might remember serelaxin for acute heart failure. It was an agent that did not make it. The company was really focused on serelaxin. My program was LCZ696. We did not have a name, generic or otherwise. We were LCZ696, and no one really cared.
Off the tongue.
Yeah, no one really cared about LCZ696. Yeah. So we were LCZ696 for a very, very long time. And no one really cared about LCZ696. No one, other than this sort of merry band of true believers, thought it would work. We were not first in line for budget. We were kind of scrappy and, had to, really, we were well financed. I don't want to make it sound like, we didn't have the right resources, but, when it came to anything extra, we weren't first in line. And so that was kind of the mood. There were some very strong advocates, and I should call out Amit Nathwani, who's current CEO of DuPont, as a real advocate for Entresto, because he stood in front of a couple of bullets to keep that thing going, because it was a risky, expensive venture, and you needed champions to keep it alive in the company.
So if you joined 2 years into phase 3, so number one, were you blinded to all of the events? Do you have any idea where things stood within the trial, and what was kind of the total number of events? What was the expected year? Because really, I mean, these cardiology in particular, these trials get so big that really, I think it's assumed that the only organizations that can run them are larger biopharma companies. They're the only ones with kind of the time horizon and the budgets and kind of the clinical clout to do it. So can you give us kind of some guideposts on, A, did you know how many events that there were? And B, you knew how many there were going to be? Did you have anything that gave you the boundaries of how long you thought this could take, or whether it was going to work?
So I'd say yes to the first part. Whether or not it was going to work was, we had confidence, but certainly no certainty there, a lot of uncertainty. So this was an 8,500 patient trial conducted in 43 countries. We certainly knew along, all through the trial, the aggregate event rate but we, obviously would have no idea, which arms patients were assigned to. That wouldn't be appropriate. There was a statistical analysis plan that made assumptions around effect size, and that was what drove our event rate. I couldn't tell you right now what we would expect the event rate to be off the top of my head, but we did expect a 15% effect size on the primary endpoint. And then we did have a statistical analysis plan with stopping rules for both futility and overwhelming efficacy. And what was unique about Entresto, which your audience may or may not know, is that this study paradigm was stopped for overwhelming efficacy, quite earlier than we expected. So we always say that launch was probably about 18 months faster than we expected because of the early stop, as well as the breakthrough designation and the fast track approval by the agency.
So that's interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the transition from development to launch, right? So typically, what does that look like? I imagine if you have a trial with time-gated endpoints, you can budget out the time and the launch team kind of knows when they're going to take the handoff. How does it work when you don't have that time-gated thing? And especially if you start early, right? How early does the launch team start, especially on, as you so lovingly say, a molecule that people didn't care about internally?
So not early enough.
I thought we were going there.
Right?
And I think it's a really great point you bring up, because this idea of transitioning from development to commercial, I think is not the way we ought to think about it. I think that as either as a venture, as a company, or even as a program, your whole purpose is commercialization. Why else do you exist? And obviously you need profits because we need sustainability, and we need to be able to reinvest and bring new medicines forward continually in a sustainable way. But also commercialization is how you get to the most patients. So that's, to have the most impact. So we should always be thinking about commercialization, no matter where you are in your life cycle, in my opinion. Maybe not all the way back to discovery, because you need to allow for serendipity in science, and you can't have everything figured out quite that early. But as you're approaching phase 2, as you're really thinking about going into first in human, really, you ought to have the end game in mind, in my opinion. And is that always done? No, it's not always done, but I think that's how we should be thinking about commercialization, and we're trying to get there as a company. I'd say back in the Entresto days, we weren't there as a company to think that far ahead. So I think probably the biggest learning for me was that we were so focused on the perfection of Paradigm, which was such an elegantly designed study, that we lost, and the regulators loved it. I say cardiorenal division loved it. We like I said, very rapid approval, but the community needed more than that, right? The cardiovascular community. And I think if we had a chance to do it over, what we would do is that we would design an entire evidence package, listening to the community beyond the elite clinical trialist. And as soon as Entresto was approved based on Paradigm results, we would be ready to roll out with additional evidence generation to answer questions important to the practicing cardiologist, because Paradigm was very important in landmark clinical trial, but didn't answer everyone's questions, and did not, made it slower for people to adopt it in clinical practice, because it was just new and there was a different way you had to approach it compared to other heart failure medicines. And so that made the launch a bit slow.
Dawn, let's pause and think about, and we spend a lot of time in everything we do, talking about patients and interaction with patients and patient advocates and things like that. Would you do anything differently in how you all engage the patient community? You just talked about the provider community, and what sort of gold standard do you see for working with the patient community in the drug development process?
Yeah, I mean, so remember, we were doing Entresto, we finished, I think, in 15 is when the study stopped. So we were just beginning to get patient input into our clinical trial designs, et cetera. So I think that's really important, because clinical trials can be quite the burden on patients. And so we want to make them as streamlined and as easy to participate in as possible. So I think that's one thing I think that we've implemented, subsequently, that's very important. The heart failure community, we did have them in mind in terms of how to do outreach to them. It's challenging because we have this perception anyway, because they're mostly, it's mostly an elderly Medicare type population,
Right.
that they're not digitally savvy, et cetera. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, we had that impression, and we weren't quite as good at digital outreach as we are now.
Yeah.
And there weren't, any patient specific groups. So, but we did do some work through American Heart as an intermediary. We had in the US, I think, a wonderful outreach program with Queen Latifah and her mother, who subsequently has passed, sadly, from heart failure. So there's good outreach there around disease awareness. But it's with such a large population that's cared for, in a fragmented way in our in our healthcare system. It's a very challenging group to reach out to.
Yeah.
It's also challenging because it's a large slice of the population, right? This is not, this is not a rare disease community with 1,000 patients who, all look to a single organization to get information. There's got to be layers of, I'll say, patient savviness, patient interest.
Yes.
You have a much larger bell curve here. And I imagine there's also a decent part of that population that I don't want to say is uninformed, but doesn't really look to be educated about it isn't quite as hungry for information about the things that are ailing them. And that in and of itself is a real big challenge.
And also, heart failure patients have a lot of comorbidities, so they're dealing with a lot.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to hone in on kind of one part of, everything that's going on with them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a laundry list of conditions a lot of times. Yep. So we have a couple questions to get to, and you kind of hit a nail here with M&A. So not to I want to actually come
talk
back
about M&A
to,
yet?
we're gonna get there though, right? So we're in a in a realm now where you actually see a number of companies that went public, right? And you have kind of depressed valuations in the public market. So I guess there's two. What the question is, how does this play out for public market companies? But I think there's really two sides to this question, right? So number one, what do you think from a larger pharma perspective about, how to look at M&A with broader market conditions like this? And I would also flip the question and say, if you're a public company, if you're a public stage biotech, how do you think about your M&A path? And let's assume that you're pre-proof of concept clinical data.
So maybe I could just frame the question to think about, how does Novartis specifically, and I think other big companies as well, although I obviously don't have that experience to know how they think. How do we think about M&A or just BD&L in general? And I think the challenge that we're having, and I'm having in the current markets, is that at least until recently, you had valuations that were not congruent with risks of those companies. So you hadn't discharged enough risk to really to make those companies as interesting to a large pharma partner at those valuations as is usually required. Right. So we will pay a premium for discharge risk, right? We paid, what was it, $10 billion for the medicines companies, and inclisiran was basically on the precipice of approval, right? The phase 3 trials were completed. Similar with Avaxis, we paid, I think it was $8 billion for Avaxis, which was basically already approved. And young companies will talk to me and be like, why are you doing that? You're so expensive. You should go earlier. And the challenge for us is that, that we do have a pretty robust pipeline with riskier projects. And it's not that we have a not invented here syndrome. It is that there is asymmetry of information. And so we understand our early stage programs, which are just as risky as someone else's early stage programs. But we understand those risks better than you ever could from going outside in on a diligence. And we do great diligences. Our teams are amazing. But there's always something you find out after diligence. It's just the nature of the beast. So I think that, we not, I wouldn't necessarily prefer to discharge risk, but we prefer to have less risk, and we will pay a premium for less risk. And the other issue, of course, is that if you're paying billions of dollars, it's important from our financial picture and our stakeholders that those deals be accretive near term. And
people tend to be interested in that. When
Yes,
you're
yes,
when you're spending billions of dollars, people tend to be interested in when they
right.
start coming back in.
Yeah. So, and so if you're doing early work, I think it pays to be very strategic, to really understand the strategic uh, importance of your program to a company. And, those things are public. You can, figure those out. And I find, at least with the younger companies I work with, that probably are, there's not so sophisticated, that they don't really get that. They don't get that they need to do their homework and look at where the strategic paths are for the different companies, and sort of narrow their customer base to those that have strategic interests where they're playing.
And then we actually had another question that's kind of building on this, but more from a global, and clearly Novartis is a global organization. And the question is basically like, with the pharmaceutical industry, a large percentage, over 50% of most pharmaceutical sales come in the US. Novartis may not have all that high a level of US sales compared to some of your competitors. How do you look at that as a company, and how do you address M&A from a global perspective, not just in the US?
Yeah, I would say that every company that I work with, be it Novartis or the dozens of startups that I mentor in North America and Europe, all want to be in the U.S. market, right? And want to be, in the case of Novartis, a top player in the U.S. market, and we are not. And one of the challenges that we have is that people will often look to us with our global footprint and be like, ex-US rights. We want you to be our ex-US partner, and we've done some really wonderful deals like that, and have been very helpful. Our European business is number one, so that's obviously worked. So, and I think that that's a challenge for us. We would love to be able to do worldwide deals, and we think that that would be the because everyone wants to be in the U.S. It's the most profitable healthcare market in the world. I mean, it makes sense to want to have your footprint here, and one of the things for for bigger companies is that scale does play to your advantage in the U.S. market, and so you do have to have that presence to get the favorable pricing with our complex Byzantine rebate system, et cetera. So scale is important.
Right. And I mean, but also, like, at the end of the day, what we do and what you do and what our pharmaceutical companies do is to try to create solutions and save lives and better lives, right? And that's required worldwide. So it is important that the infrastructure Novartis has across the world can really become key in helping smaller companies that don't have that infrastructure distribute their medicines, right, in the global scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's if the impact that you can have, and I think that's I made the joke about I was planning to be here 3 to 5 years. Actually, not a joke, that's true, and I've been here for 10 years. It is that global impact that is so addicting. Like, it's amazing, this giant machine, what it can do, for the good of humanity, and that's why I'm still here 10 years later.
So you've brought up a couple of things that I think are an interesting segue here. So can you talk a little bit about your kind of role and remit at Novartis? Because people see strategic partnerships, they don't really entirely know what that encompasses. And I think your role is really interesting because it's not, I don't think it's the exact straight down the line partner. You get to think really outside the proverbial box. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe a little bit of the ways that you're approaching things in this environment?
Sure. So the name strategic partnerships is probably not descriptive of what we do, as you indicated here. Is chosen for historical reasons, which I won't, and internally focused reasons, which I won't bore your listeners with. But I work in the white space. So where we're looking at are disruptive white space or gray space opportunities that are not currently in strategy. So we have fabulous search and eval teams who are focused on the business, who are developing deep relationships with young companies and executing these great deals. So we're looking between the cracks. This was put into place when we went to our franchise structure as a hedge, because you get really focused in your area. There may be emerging areas bubbling up that you'll miss. because of your focus. And so we wanted to build this team as a hedge. And this team's been around for a long time, but I've been around for about 2 years. And so we look at emerging areas of science. We look at trends and the types of company creation that's going on. As we see, like, a cluster of certain companies being formed, that will ping our interest, and we'll do a deep dive into that. We also provide strategic guidance to the executive committee, on broader issues, related to internal strategy. Should we, are there deals we should be doing to enhance our internal strategy? Those types of things. So, not a lot I can talk about publicly, but it's the gist of it.
You can just wave your hands and we won't notice. Yeah. Behind the curtain, we have,
just read the forward-looking statements slide. We don't usually have people do that, but you may say some forward-looking statements.
And I am, not a spokesperson for Novartis. Opinions are my own. All those things.
Well, that's actually really interesting. So I imagine it's talk to us a little bit about the, since you do things that are considered, slightly orthogonal from strategy, the most likely outcome of you saying something is interesting is probably, well, that's not in our strategy right now, right? I mean, I think one of the challenges of looking at the places where you're not building is you have a whole strategic team that says this is what you should be doing. And, do you have to play a little bit of a role of, this is important now, we also need to adjust and think about this thing over here?
So we do we absolutely do get that a lot of times, but we do work very closely with corporate strategy. So they're always in the loop on these things. And this is, we sort of provide what we call edge thinking. And that's a term that Vaz brought to us, is edge thinking, of kind of always being out there and what is the edge. And then we understand that the things we do aren't necessarily going to turn into projects tomorrow, but they do inform long-term goals, so and we have seen that happen, and that's very satisfying, and to start new projects. And so we've had that happen, but most of the time we get told, no, it's not strategy. But you know what, we monitor these areas, and when something breaks, and inevitably someone in senior management sends out an email and says, what do we think of this? We want to have be ready to have an opinion about, this is what we've looked at, this is what we think of. So it's a bit of being proactive as well.
Is the rise of remote heart monitoring kind of one of those places? Is this a trend that really kind of sits within your wheelhouse, and is this something that you think could have a decent effect in shaping how we think about heart failure or cardiology in general?
So when I think that some of the remote monitoring things can really help with implementing therapies well, and making sure patients are maximized on their heart failure therapies. There are a lot of great evidence-based heart failure therapies that are in the guidelines now. And if you looked at the percent of patients who are on guideline-directed therapy, it's embarrassing still. Yeah. And part of that is because it's complicated, right? It takes time to titrate these medicines. They pretty much all affect blood pressure. So, it's a bit of an art in getting patients up to maximal guideline-directed therapy. And I think remote heart monitoring can help with some of that, and telemedicine as well, make it easier on the patient and easier on the healthcare system. So I think in that regard, it can be very helpful. In terms of heart failure trials and sort of making those easier or less expensive, I think it could have some role, and I think other innovations in clinical trials can help with that as well. I think, though, at the end of the day, it's the risk the inherent risk that you still have in the phase 3 that is what keeps those types of trials in the realm of big pharma. Because there's no way you can discharge that risk with phase 2, as we talked about. There's no kind of surrogate that would predict it. And even if you're able to get, and the trials have to be big, if not only for efficacy, to find those efficacy differences, but also for safety, right? When you have a prevalent population, or a large prevalent population, FDA is going to want to see big trials for safety. So even if you can get it down to like 50 million, which you probably could, that's still a big bet to make for someone whose cost of capital is not, around 8% or 10%, or wherever our cost of capital, a big pharma cost of capital is. It's difficult. Yeah.
We've actually had a couple of different questions continuing sort of along the M&A the M&A theme. And the gist of it is basically with a number of biotech companies that went public over the last few years, and the current market conditions, as far as being sustainable. How do you see this crop, we'll call them, right, of recently public biotechs playing into either Novartis or other companies' M&A strategy now?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think these you have to, your acquisition cost to risk, inherent clinical risk, has to match somehow. And some of these companies are just going to need to do more work to discharge additional risk before they're going to be candidates for some companies. Now, I think that there might be more M&A opportunities in kind of the mid-size to mid-size, or even small to small. Could be interesting to bring some of those together. I mean, the other piece of the puzzle that we didn't talk about previously for large pharma is materiality, right? So, I mean, we need to grow, say mid-single, high single digits. It's kind of the benchmark for most of companies in our class, on a 50 billion revenue base. I mean, you got to have good products to do that. And so if you're in rare cancer or things like that, it's just really challenging to have the kind of materiality that makes the juice worth the squeeze, honestly.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you went there, because we have another question about kind of scientific failure risk and commercial risk. And when you start with the science, you can't dictate a 50 million patient pool, right? You end up where you end up in a lot of ways. So the levers that you have are really kind of, at the end of the day, number of patients and perhaps the price of the therapy. But like you said, not everything is going to fit into the box of larger biopharma. So kind of one of two things need to happen. Either a company like Novartis is going to have to execute 3 or 4x the kind of mergers and transactions per year, or there needs to be kind of some other entity that actually is an appropriately sized commercial entity for these things to get absorbed. And these are therapies that maybe sub-billion-dollar therapies. So to get to an actual question, is solution one even an option? Does Novartis or really any larger biopharma have the ability to do more deals, or are we kind of progressing towards you need a mega merger type deal in order to get that kind of revenue bump?
Yeah, I mean, that's something obviously that's talked about a lot, and the of course the other side of the coin is for a substantial merger, a substantial M&A with a company that was accretive in the near term and has synergies that we can realize, and it comes at a reasonable price. If you can get all those boxes checked, then you've got the FTC to think about. And so you certainly don't want a protracted FTC evaluation, because that's value destroying. So it's a bit dancing on the head of a pin.
And then actually another question along those lines is can pharma manage a greater number of deals if the value is there, or is bandwidth a limiting factor?
No, I think bandwidth is there is definitely a limitation based on resources that we have allocated to diligences and deal making. Really probably more on the diligence front, because the diligence requires so much resource from the line functions, right? Who are experts and who are amazing, but also have a portfolio to execute on. So there's definitely a limit to how many deals that we could take into diligence based on our resources that we have for that.
Yep. Dawn, talk to us a little bit. Obviously, we're not asking for specifics, but talk to us a little bit about your process for identifying something that might be in a crack that you would then find interesting from a Novartis corporate perspective. How do you even go about discovering things that could be beneficial to Novartis in your space?
So we have a few innovation sourcing ways that we do this. First of all, me and my partner are very experienced, drug commercialization experts and drug developers. So there is a bit of pattern recognition there, right? So we're just externally focused. We're always looking. as you know, as you mentioned, I mentor dozens of startups every year in 3 different accelerators. I do EFL at NYU, I do Creative Destruction Lab in Toronto, and I do a European program called EIT Health Gold Track. So that helps me to see just all the crazy stuff that's coming out of academia that postdocs or PIs are taking out. And so that's helpful. We definitely look at company creation, venture creation, coming through with who's getting Series A funding, who's getting seed funding. So we look externally. That's our primary source of inspiration. But then, we have really, really smart and creative people who work at Novartis. And so we do sort of some crowdsourcing type things. So NIBR does something called Genesis Labs, which basically internal teams can bring forward sort of a skunk works project and get a little bit of funding and get some time off to work on that for, I think it's up to a year. And we collaborate very closely with colleagues across the organization to sort of, to be plugged in to those creative scientists and innovation networks and keep our pulse on what they think is exciting.
So we had one other question here that we kind of almost have to ask, and it's a good one, which is, thinking about anti-infectives and antibiotics, right? So, we are, as a society, we are kind of desperate for innovation here. It's a huge problem, and as the attendee so deftly put it, is this a chronic commercial graveyard, which is an unfortunately accurate term given the state of how things have gone there.
Indeed. We officially exited infectious diseases a few years back. We do still have initiatives in tropical medicine and malaria as part of our global health commitment. But yes, it's very challenging to bring these forward. I think we're going to need new commercial models to bring new medicines forward for resistant bacterial infections or viral infections. And I do think that the pandemic has opened our eyes to that, and I hope that we'll see some progress there.
Yeah, no, it's really it's incredibly challenging. You talk to anyone in the actual hospital, and it's not, the hurdles beyond clinical efficacy are real, and it's hard to see companies that have these therapies that are actually really good. They show efficacy, and then kind of can't actually get them to the patients that need them. We can switch gears a little bit here, because you started talking about things like creative destruction labs and really kind of the earlier part of the innovation ecosystem. So let's actually talk a little bit about ecosystem building, and maybe give us a little bit of kind of background on where you play in some of those areas, and then we'll get into places like New York, places like Toronto, and it's really kind of the growth of the ecosystem that we want to think about, because so many of them have the academic expertise, et cetera. And let's talk a little bit about how you stoke all of those things into this kind of thriving ecosystem that we all kind of are hoping to build.
Sure. So I'm fascinated as to why some geographies become these amazing startup, places. And so I've done a little bit of like a reading on there's scholarship around this. I guess there's scholarship on everything. And it's clear that, there is this kind of a agglomeration economics, I think they call it, that is fundamental for all startup ecosystems, no matter what industry. And that's basically like these disparate pieces have to come together in one place to create the magic, to create some kind of critical mass. You have to have good network effects within that, and you have to have, I'm forgetting my notes on that. You have to have kind of transfer of information and talent. It has to be fluid, right? So it has to come together, but then it has to like talk to each other and be fluid. And I think for biotech ecosystems, you need foundational science, right? You need talent, to execute, to come up with the science, and then you need talent to build companies, and then you need access to infrastructure like lab space and patients, and then ultimately you need capital. And then for biotech, you need lots and lots and lots of capital to make it work. And so when that agglomeration comes together in a place, then you get that critical mass, and then it's kind of self-feeding, right? It's a virtuous circle. When you have exits, VCs pay attention, talent gets circulated, other entrepreneurs get inspired to spin stuff out. Like I was inspired, by Clive.
Mhm.
So I think that there's this kind of virtuous circle. And I must say, I was in the startup ecosystem in kind of New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia in 2012. And we formed our company in Pennsylvania because we could not get any startup capital anywhere else, right? We got our startup capital from BioAdvance.
Yep.
And there just wasn't startup capital available elsewhere. And the tremendous growth, when I came back from Canada in 2020 and saw what was going on in New York, I was flabbergasted. It's like night and day, the progress that has been made. And so those of you who have been doing it incrementally may not see it as dramatically as I did coming back after, being away for a period of time, but it's striking. So, whatever you guys are doing, Derek and Jennifer, keep doing it because it's working.
Yeah, well, it's funny as somebody, so I've been in New York for about 16 years now, and I think a lot of the formational work for the gains that we've seen in the last 5 years really started, in 2012 and before it, right? And I think like a lot of things in biotech, it takes time. I don't think you can snap your fingers and make it work overnight. Like you said, it takes a lot of capital. Lab space doesn't get built in 5 minutes, and hundreds of millions of dollars in capital don't get deployed like that on a whim either. So there's a lot of kind of reputation building, and there's a lot of work that goes into kind of getting the first stepping stones laid and taking those first few steps that allow kind of the growth that we've seen in the last few years to happen. And it's never assured, right? That's the other really difficult thing. It's even as you're kind of laying those early stage stepping stones, if that infusion of capital doesn't come, if some of those companies don't work out, if the next kind of large financing doesn't come, people can lose interest and go somewhere else. Money is imminently portable. So it's one of those things that's really, really hard. So if we think about a place like Toronto, right? Toronto, as lovely as Toronto is not New York, but they've managed to, they have really great science. They have, excellent, stem cell regenerative medicine. They have a JLabs hub. They've made a lot of that stuff work. And that has actually, been, I think, a continuously, growing and solid ecosystem.
Yeah. And one thing that I will say that, about Toronto is the inclusiveness of the community. Mm-hmm. So they welcome me, an ugly American, from a big pharma company with open arms. And I still, very close relationships, still work very closely with Toronto to this day, even though I've been back now for a couple of years. And I think that inclusiveness is really important. And I think that's something that New York has. I think New York has my experience so far in interfacing with the New York ecosystem, it's also very inclusive and welcoming of newcomers. And I think that is also very important. And I think that's an advantage that we can have over, other ecosystems, which I won't name, but which you probably know, which are not so inclusive.
Not that we have any Voldemort ecosystems out there.
No.
But I feel like, and the other thing that I think that Toronto does have going for it is that I think we've done well in New York, and always can do better. Is government funding. I mean, they built. I'm very, very good friends with the head of the Center for the Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine, when they've built a GMP grade stem cell cell therapy manufacturing facility that had capacity to go up to phase 3 in the middle of downtown Toronto in the Mars building with government funding. I mean, it's just incredible, the commitment that the government has had to translational science and commercialization. I think that's been very helpful.
Yeah,
not to go all New York on you, but we've got that too, the stem cell.
I know, we've got
one of those
in New York.
And what's interesting here, well, obviously New York is much bigger and more spread out as a whole state than Toronto is, right, as a city. But we've had investment by not necessarily, and definitely in building and supporting lab space, particularly in the city, but also in the state. But we've had a series of state and city investments over the past years, which, as Derek said, have taken time, but the culmination now has created When I first came to New York Bio 4 years ago, we were still doing some of the hand wringing over we don't have space, we don't have wet lab space. And largely, we'll say, that problem has been solved, right, by private and public commitments. And now one thing I'd like for you to talk about, particularly maybe in your experience as Toronto, is where I think we are now in New York, which we have so many successful pieces of this puzzle. But one thing that we're still achieving is this, what I call flywheel of executive talent.
Yeah.
And it takes those exits, they want to do it again, right? And people want to live in New York, which is fantastic. I do too. And so I think that it's getting that flywheel of talent. And how did you see that develop in Toronto? And what analogies could you make for New York in the future?
Yeah, and one of the things that we definitely saw in Toronto, and I think is still an issue for Canada in general, is lack of executive talent that's been there, done that, right? Because you don't have the multinationals. Those are a very different skill set of people who came up through there, and you just don't have people with that kind of deep drug development expertise at the C-suite level. Yeah. And so one of the things they did in the beginning was actually have infrastructure in the U.S. They had headquarters in Boston or in New York, and then they had the science team in Toronto, and that worked well for them. And then they've gotten, I think, Versant should be credited with this, and they're a nice addition to the New York ecosystem as well. But in the Canadian ecosystem, they also play a very important part of really developing that C-suite talent, and then they get the exits, and then they can recycle that. I think that we should also, so it's going to be heresy, so don't throw me out of the meeting for this, but New Jersey at one point in time was America's medicine chest. So, there's a lot of talent across the river that you can tap into as well, that I think you got to find. Somebody once said, I once met a person from Pfizer who spun out a company, and I thought that was so antithetical to me, that, a big pharma entrepreneur, would spin out a company. And he said, you just have to find the crazy ones, they're there, right? You just have to find them in pharma. We're here. Not all people are well suited that are attracted to pharma are well suited for startups, but there are some.
We do love our friends across the river in New Jersey, and actually, all joking aside, do actually work closely with Bio New Jersey, right? Bio NJ, as well as we have people that live in the city that commute into New Jersey and vice versa. So it really is a regional ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which we hope that all of that grows, including our ecosystem in New Jersey.
As things get big enough, right? There's bleed through effects, right? And it's what you want. And we sit in this weird border, quite honestly, where there's Connecticut and New Jersey not too far away. So I think if it would be silly to think that if New York gets to be this large, huge biohub, that things aren't going to bleed over to other places. And honestly, for the industry, that's incredibly good. I think from a broad perspective, the more good companies we see started, it's just going to build upon itself. And both New York and New Jersey are very commutable in between each other. Although, again, you only pay the George Washington Bridge fee coming this way, so that's, I guess, an advantage.
You always have to pay to leave New Jersey, if you've noticed.
That's true. They get you one more time on the way.
Although truly recruiting people, you would just not mention the GW Bridge at all.
Yeah.
Trains are great.
Trains are great. So let's see. We actually do have one question, and I don't want to ignore the Sandoz question, right?
Yes.
So the question is, are there synergies with Sandoz that you leverage in Novartis M&A and operations?
So I will say the Sandoz M&A or the Sandoz BD&L, team is actually part of the larger, BD&L team. They're all together for now, as we're undergoing strategic review for Sandoz, and including the diligence teams who I'm close to. We're all part of the same team. So we absolutely, share learnings and leverage expertise. It's obviously a very different business, the diligence that's in the BD&L they do versus what we do. We also leverage our scientists. I mean, there's amazing scientists at Sando who we've connected with our scientists at NIBR and working on some innovative projects. So, we try to find those synergies where they make sense.
And when you say NIBR, you mean your U.S. Innovation Center, right?
Yes. So NIBR, sorry, this is the Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research. It's our research and discovery entity. That is actually a separate entity. Yeah.
Okay.
From the other parts of the business. Yeah.
Since we're getting into the last 10 minutes, I actually really like this question. So this question says, as a startup mentor, what is one key piece of advice that you would give to companies in the drug development space? And broadly, I would say what kind of advice, not just one key piece, but what's some of the advice that you give companies in the development space?
So, the challenge that I always see for every company, if there's one thread that runs through it, is that when at early stage, they don't understand their strategy and they can't tell their story. And so you have to really clearly early on hone in on what problem you are solving and who are you solving it for. It's basics, but in discovery science, I think it's even harder because you have this technology can do a lot of different things and
Right.
you don't necessarily know where it fits. And so I think that's the main thing is figure out, what that value prop is.
Yeah.
And if you're a flashback to you coming out of academia, right? If you're someone who's in academia, maybe pre-tenure, and you're still thinking about not quite as crazy as getting tenure and then leaving, but if you're thinking about going into industry or even being an entrepreneur, what advice would you give to your earlier self and to those thinking about doing that today? What things should they be looking out for? What action should they be taking within the communities? Like, how do they even really think about that?
So I think the best advice that I ever got is probably to network. I think your network is maybe more important than anything else. You're gonna, your network will present you with opportunities. Your network will present you for opportunities for positions, opportunities for learning. There's just so much growth that you can do through a network. And I think it's actually important in small networks and in biotech to be known, right? So it's like, because people will say like, do you know Dawn? What do you think about her, right? So to get known in that network, I think is also important. So if I were younger, I would probably start, I would advise my younger self to work on the network earlier than I did. Yeah.
So go to New York Bio events.
Yeah.
Go to New York Bio events, for sure.
Absolutely.
You know what someone once told me? I'm sorry to cut you off there, but this is some of the best advice early on. He says, someone said to me, keep coming until they miss you when you're not here.
Yes.
So there's an event and they're like, oh,
it's not here today. Yeah.
Yes, although the allegory to that is I've never heard this before, but my favorite titled country song, which is "How Can I Miss You If You Won't Go Away." There is another good. So I like that you hit on storytelling, because there was a question before that I wasn't sure how to work in, but I like it here. It said and it's about a number of companies kind of chasing the same scientific targets, right? And what are some of the ways that companies or scientists can actually tell their story in a space that's really crowded, right? It's incredibly difficult to get any sort of breathing room, whether it's immuno-oncology, cell and gene therapy. So much has gone into all of these spaces. How do you think about telling a story that differentiates whatever it is that you are working on, especially to either the venture community or BD teams that they've seen you 100 times? How do you make yours different?
Well, I mean, I hope yours is different, right? Like you want to bring something new to the party. So
that would be one thing. Actually, be different.
But I do think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, differentiation is key. So how, what elements of your science, your data, can you pull out so that you could show that that you are differentiated compared to the pack, that you are better for a certain set. Maybe it's your indication, maybe it's your mechanism. It's really going to depend specifically on the science, but I think that is key. You need to differentiate in these crowded spaces for sure. Yeah. Or it's going to be, it's another blah, 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 and you're dead.
Yeah.
One area that we haven't talked about, which you have served and you serve on several boards. And talk to us about how you became interested in serving as a board member, in addition to all of the other things that you do, and what advice you would give someone who's thinking about, pursuing potential board roles in the future?
Oh, thanks for that question, Jennifer. So I think that, board service, and I use the word service very intentionally here, is a bit of the ultimate, the pinnacle in a career, because you're taking, the everything that you've learned across your career and being able to give that guidance to, either to a CEO or to a team or to other board members, frankly. And so I think the best advice I ever got about board service is look at the board that you are interested in serving in and figure out what you add to the equation that is not brought forward by other board members or the management team. And if your secret sauce, your special skill set isn't better than who's already there, then you need to find a different board, right? Like, you're not going to add value to that board. So I love that advice. And then, I'm searching for my first public board now. And I think you really need to think about, why do you want to do board service? Really have a good rationale. I think the complexity and the challenge in a public board, especially right now with everything that's going on, is super interesting. And I think I would really enjoy that. But I also believe that, good governance of corporations is essential to a well-functioning society, just like good governance of communities, good governance of countries. And we need, high quality board members to do that service, as a public service. And so, that's, one of the things that I'm really, really dedicated to being able to contribute to.
Yep. We do have a question about how people can stay in touch with you, and do you have a preferred method of contact, or for people to find you?
Sure. I mean, I'm more than happy. You can email me. It's super easy. It's dawnbell@dawnbell.com. So
that one, that one's also hard.
I would say this is also in addition to finding you at any of the NewYorkBIO events. That would be the easiest way. That'd be the easiest way.
I'll always be there with bells on, and then obviously all the social media. So I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm the Dawn Bell on Twitter. The Dawn Bell.
I do like, we called out that handle a couple of times. I do like the Dawn Bell thing. It adds an immediate level of importance. There may be other.
There was already a Dawn Bell, so I needed to differentiate. I couldn't take the Dawn Bell.
Well, that other Dawn Bell has unfortunately been put in at least second place at this point. So we have a couple minutes left, and we've covered a lot of things. We've talked M&A. We've talked kind of broader state of the market, and we ask people to do this every once in a while. And you're in, you have a particularly tough job here. We ask people to talk a little bit about the future. And we ask you to talk about the future, and you're someone who literally looks at the future all the time for your job. So why don't you give us one or two things that you think may be coming down the pipe in the future that people in the industry aren't talking about a lot? What are some of the things that you think may be on the precipice that aren't in everyday conversation now?
Oh man, that's hard.
Sorry, got to give you at least one hard question.
I had one, but then you said that they're not talking about a lot, so that's challenging. One thing that I don't know if we're talking about enough is the role of the changing role of the founder in startups, especially in biotech startups. We have a bias. I think I have this bias that you need to you can't come out of academia founding a company, but that's been disproven three times. So I do think that there are founders who want to take their companies out of academia and through, value inflection points, and depending on, that entrepreneur, they want to take it all the way or not. And I think that we ought to be thinking about that differently as an ecosystem and supporting them to grow, into the kind of leaders that they would like to be to build their company and their vision.
Yeah.
Versus, putting a gray haired person like me at the helm all the time, kind of thing.
I think that's a great answer.
Well, I have no gray hairs, and it may just be because of my colorist.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Exactly. Dawn, this has been a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. It's been fun and informative, and I know our audience has appreciated it just by the volume of questions and engagement that we've gotten from the audience today. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We really appreciated it, and I know our audience did as well. So everyone, have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you next week.
Right.
Enjoy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.